Now, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister is on his way to Paris, where the UK and France are to chair a virtual meeting aimed at establishing a multilateral mission to restore the safe passage of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Officials say around 40 countries are willing to join an operation in the Gulf. President Macron has said this wouldn't include either the US or Iran. Now, that summit comes as tens of thousands of Lebanese people are heading back home in the south of the country after a ceasefire came into effect. The Iranian-backed group Hezbollah says it'll abide by the 10-day truce between Israel and Lebanon. The ceasefire was brokered by the United States after 6 weeks of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. The deal is also expected to help efforts to end the US-Israeli war against Iran. Well, my colleague Helena Humphrey is in Paris, where the Prime Minister is heading to join President Macron. Helena.
That's right, Nikki. We are expecting the arrival of Sir Keir Starmer in about an hour from now. I'm here on the Champs-Élysées in the heart of Paris, just a stone's throw away from the Élysée Palace, where Sir Keir Starmer will be chairing that meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron. Emmanuel Macron very keen to specify that this would be about a defensive mission to secure the Strait of Hormuz when conditions allow, presumably in some kind of post-conflict future in all of this, as you've been mentioning, around 40 countries set to take part in that video conference, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what it would look like to secure the safe passage on the Strait of Hormuz. But let's talk more about all of this now with our Paris correspondent who joins me now, James Waterhouse. James, really good to have you with us. What are the expectations ahead of this meeting?
Well, I think it's important to look at today as still within the realms of the politics around this war. People will hear the words operation, deployment, and think, okay, this is going to see a wider involvement by America's other allies. But this is about, I think, them having their political voices heard. We don't have US representation here today. We don't have any from the Israeli side. And of course, it's not clear to what extent the Israelis have been consulted. Nevertheless, they're talking about military escorts for ships, they're talking about demining, they're talking about the sharing of intelligence. And I think what they are trying to do is split the difference. They are not happy with Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz, but they're equally not happy about America's naval blockade in response. They're blocking, the US Navy's blocking Iranian ports to try and limit their oil exports. And so what this is trying to do, I think, is to restore confidence in the shipping companies, the shipping insurers, but also to prop up in some way these very fragile ceasefires that we now have in place across the Middle East.
James, I've heard a number of analysts liken this to the coalition of the willing when it comes to Ukraine. And I want to get your thoughts on that, because having covered the war in Ukraine so extensively for so many years, we know that the coalition of the willing was not an easy task either. So what does that mean for this particular conflict?
Yeah, there's a big difference, isn't there, between willing and able. And I think, if you are Europe in these times where you have a White House that is less than impressed with Europe's defence spending over recent years, you have a White House that is disinterested in large parts with the war in Ukraine at the moment, you have a White House that is engaging in its own almost unilateral operations in Venezuela. We've seen what has been going on alongside Israel against Iran. So what we are seeing here is Europe once again saying, look, here is what we would do if you were to alter course. And they are talking in plain terms to America, the main player in this. It is America that is still the dominant military force here. So this is part of the politics. It may well transpire that countries like the UK, like France, will deploy demining ships in the future. But for now, we are seeing pledges to try and solidify the pause in fighting we see at the moment. Not least, they also want to try and ease global markets, because the shockwaves from this war, as we know, are going to be felt for some time.
Indeed, and certainly in a conflict that many of these European leaders arriving here in Paris believe has no legal basis. For now, James, many thanks for your reporting. Look forward to talking to you again throughout the course of the day. Well, of course, James was mentioning those fragile ceasefires throughout the region. The latest developments being, of course, that ceasefire for 10 days between Israel and Lebanon. We can cross over now to Jerusalem and speak to our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Knell. Yolande, just bring us up to date with what we are seeing on the ground with regards to that ceasefire and whether it appears to be holding.
Well, first of all, that ceasefire is an agreement between Israel and Lebanon, but of course it's Hezbollah, the Lebanese armed group backed by Iran, that has been fighting with Israel over the past 6 weeks. There have been really fierce battles on the ground after an Israeli ground invasion, and Hezbollah has continued to fire rockets at the north of Israel until just a minute before this midnight deadline came into effect, midnight local time, for the ceasefire to take hold. Now, it had got off to a shaky start. There were reports from Lebanon too about continued Israeli military shelling of villages in southern Lebanon. But for the moment, it largely seems to be holding. The Israeli press have really been sort of picking over all of this, as you'd expect this morning. It caught a lot of people by surprise because it was President Trump himself who came out and made the declaration about this ceasefire, and some members of the security cabinet in Israel had not been properly informed by the Prime Minister, according to reports. A lot of angry responses coming from the mayors in the north of Israel, saying that their citizens there feel betrayed by the ceasefire. They really want this issue of the disarmament of Hezbollah to be finally dealt with. Otherwise, they say that the country keeps returning to rounds of fighting. They feel under threat. What the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said in a late-night video message, he said that the Israeli forces would remain deep within Lebanese territory. He said that they weren't going anywhere for the time being. They're 6 miles in, he said. That's where Israel's setting up what it's calling a security buffer zone to try to protect its citizens in the north. Now, Hezbollah, although it has said is sticking by this agreement, it credits Iran with having brokered it because, of course, in the background here are the discussions that have been going on with the US and mediators to try to extend the ceasefire to stop the war between the US and Israel and Iran. But, you know, what Hezbollah is also saying in one of its statements is saying that the Lebanese people have the right to resist Israel's occupation of Lebanese territory. So that does seem to sort of, you know, leave open possible complications there in terms of this ceasefire.
Indeed. Yolande Knell there, our Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem. Good to talk to you. Thank you. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back. You are live with BBC News. Shortly before the break, we were talking about that 10-day ceasefire which was agreed between Israel and Lebanon. We can cross live now to Lebanon, to Beirut, and speak to Neda Attallah, who is a Beirut correspondent for The National. Neda, very good to have you with us here on BBC News. Just bring us up to date with the mood there in Lebanon, just a number of hours into that ceasefire, and whether it appears to be holding.
Yes, sure. So yeah, for now it appears to be holding. I'm actually now on the road to southern Lebanon, and I think one word can sum up the mood. It's happiness and impatience to go back for the southerners to go back to their homes. Even though it's just a 10-day ceasefire, the road is packed. We saw lots of cars with like belongings of their families, full of belongings of the families finally able to come back to their villages. Just yesterday night, people were already on the road back to the south, despite one of the main bridges connecting the north to the south being completely destroyed. So people were just actually crossing the bridge, walking. They were crossing the bridge on scooter because they were so impatient to finally be able to check on the property, to check on the house. There's 1 million of Lebanese displaced. It's 1/5 of the population, and they had enough of living in tents, sleeping in the streets. So they were very happy to be finally able to return home, but they're still cautious. And authorities have told people in displaced people not to come back home because there's a track record of Israeli ceasefire not being respected, so they're afraid that they might be still see some strikes or some violations. But despite those warnings, the road is packed, and yeah, and people are quite happy, but still cautious. And on the long term, the main sticking points, notably the Israeli occupation of the south, remain unresolved, and you also have many people, many southern residents who are not able to return to their houses because it's still under Israeli occupation as of now.
Yes. Neda, you mentioned some of the sticking points there. We know that Hezbollah says that for the time being that it will abide by the conditions of the ceasefire, but it will not commit to disarming. How difficult does this make that for Lebanon, which has not previously been able to convince Hezbollah to disarm?
So, yeah, this is one of the main sticking points. So now the next for Lebanon is...
It appears that unfortunately we have lost the line there with Neda Atalla. Our apologies, but thank you very much, Neda, for being with us. Well, our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is now inside Tehran. She is reporting from Iran on the condition that her reporting is not broadcast by BBC's Persian language service. That is the same condition which applies to all international journalism organisations operating within the country. Let's take a look now at her latest report from inside Iran.
There's been a statement from the foreign ministry here welcoming the 10-day ceasefire with Lebanon. Iran had insisted from the beginning that the original agreement on this temporary truce had been across the region. That's what Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had said, a ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon. Now, whether it was Iranian pressure or pressure from other fronts that allowed this new part of the ceasefire, this 10-day truce with Lebanon, to come into force will, of course, continue to be discussed. But when it comes to President Trump's other statements, really upbeat assessment of the progress of the talks, there has been a silence from Tehran. That you mentioned that the ambassador at the United Nations said he was cautiously optimistic. On first glance, it would seem really, really difficult to imagine that even within the last week they would be able to close the gap on these really highly technical and highly sensitive issues. We do live in unprecedented times when it comes to relations between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States of America. A month ago, if you would ask, and we did ask many really seasoned Iran watchers whether could there be high-level face-to-face talks between the leaders of Iran during this war with the leaders of the United States, so their arch enemy of the last half century, they would have said, no, it's impossible. So those direct face-to-face talks did take place in Islamabad last weekend. But even so, you speak to American and European negotiators who were locked in 18 months of negotiations with the Iranians the last time a nuclear deal was reached. They were months of breakthrough and breakdown. What we do hear is that they are beginning to close the gaps. Whether the deal is done, well, we've only heard it so far from President Trump.